On the other hand, you can weigh all the factors and still say, I think it is possible that the right can be implemented. I think honest people can disagree about that question. There's only two aspects which I think honest people cannot disagree on. Number one, legally, Palestinians have a right of return. About that, there should be no question and doubt. And number two, that the overarching framework for resolving the conflict, the two-state settlement on the June 1967 border, that overarching framework is not controversial. It's very straightforward and very unambiguous. One issue that does arise, and it did perplex me for some time, they would say, but if you have a right, and then you say, but you can't implement the right, then what does it mean to speak about a right? It doesn't seem to make any sense. And I see Reem nodding her head. It doesn't seem to make sense, right? It seems like a rhetorical device to say you have a right, but then sort of snatch back the right by saying, well, it can't be implemented in the real world. How many people find that perplexing to make that claim? Okay, I did too. I did too. And then last year, if you allow a personal anecdote, which I'm not at all trying to compare, I'm just trying to make an analogy which clarified the issue for me. So last year I was denied tenure at my university, and I felt, if I can use an expression, that I had the right to return. And my lawyer said, yes, I think you can win this case. But the lawyer said to me, you have to be prepared. It's going to be 6 years. That's how long tenure cases take. And she said, a wonderful lawyer, Lynn Burnaby, she said it's going to not only be costly, and she was very generous, just as a matter of record, because I like her a great deal. She said, not that she was charging a humongous sum, but she said it's going to be very time-consuming, because I'm going to have to spend the next 6 years preparing legal briefs for court, because no one knows the case like I do. And then she said the other option is to seek a settlement. Now, I thought I had the right of return. I felt legally my rights had been violated, and the consensus was that my rights were violated. But then I had to make a choice. Do I go for a 6-year battle, which by the time I finish, I'll be ready for retirement, or do I seek a short-term settlement? And I chose the route of a settlement. Does that mean I am acknowledging I don't have the right? No, I have the right. But I also have the option of accepting something short of the right called a settlement. And the settlement in my case is not very different than what it seems the Palestinians have been looking for. I'm not telling anyone what to do. I'm simply rehearsing the factual documentary record. If you look at the record of negotiations in Camp David on this whole refugee question, the Palestinians are basically looking for two things. Number one, there has to be a recognition, acknowledgement by Israel of what it did. There has to be a statement of acknowledgement of the injustice that was committed. In my own little way, that's exactly what I fought for from DePaul. They had to make a statement, and it was not easy to get that statement, acknowledging my record as a professor at DePaul. And secondly, there has to be some sort of material component. Compensation is the fancy word. And I think I'm not recommending it. I'm simply saying as a factual matter, it seems to me that's one way to look at the refugee question. But looking at it that way in no way means Palestinians don't have a right of return. They do. And Israel's position, which it's repeatedly stated, namely, we accept no historical, moral, legal, or political responsibility for what happened to the Palestinians in 1948, in my opinion, it's a non-starter. It's a non-starter for the very same reason that if Paul was not willing to make this statement on my behalf, there were no negotiations. We were going to continue and we were going to fight it out. That's how I see it. Let me now, I see I got the hook, as they say. How about if we let me go on for 20 more minutes? Does that seem fair? Okay. I want now to quickly look at the other aspect, namely the fake controversy that looms around the Israel-Palestine conflict. And it has many aspects. I'm going to just, for reasons of time, I'm going to just look at two. Number one, the pretense that this conflict is so complicated, so intricate, that it requires a knowledge the equivalent of rocket science to penetrate its mysteries. And we're told it's so complicated and so unique that you can't compare the conflict with any other conflict in the world. And the reason for that claim is fairly straightforward. Namely, when you make the obvious comparisons, Israel always ends up on the wrong side. So don't compare. Do not compare. If you look at the conflict historically, the obvious analogy which leaps off the page is to what happened to Native Americans in North America. But when you make that comparison, Israel is not the Native Americans. It's those that dispossessed them. So do not compare. If you make the most obvious analogy with the current situation in the occupied territories, the obvious analogy is, of course, the South Africa analogy. But if you make the comparison with South Africa, again, Israel comes out on the wrong side of the analogy, so do not compare. What's quite illuminating, I think, is that these sorts of comparisons are not only obvious, but they are so uncontroversial anywhere else in the world except for here. Former President Carter comes out with a book, Peace Not Apartheid, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid, causes a hysteria in the United States. How can he compare? How can he compare Israel's main human rights organization for the occupied territories, B'Tselem? What does it conclude in its major 2002 study? The regime in the occupied territories is the only one of its kind in the world and is reminiscent of distasteful regimes from the past, such as the apartheid regime in South Africa. B'Tselem 2006 comes out with a new report on the Jews-only roads that Israel has been building in the occupied territories. What does it conclude? That this road regime bears striking similarities to the racist apartheid regime and even entail a greater degree of arbitrariness than was the case with the regime that existed in South Africa. 2006, Israel's most influential newspaper, Haaretz, refers to the apartheid regime in the territories, which remains intact. October 2007, Haaretz refers to the de facto separation, which today is more similar to political apartheid than an occupation regime because of its constancy. Israel's former Attorney General, Michael Ben-Yair, he writes, "We established an apartheid regime in the occupied territories immediately following their capture. that oppressive regime exists to this day. Israel's former Minister of Education, Shulamith Aloni, the U.S. Jewish establishment's onslaught on former President Carter is based on him daring to tell the truth, which is known to all except those in the United States. Through its army, the government of Israel practices a brutal form of apartheid in the territory it occupies. And then just today, before coming here, I opened up my internet, look at leading stories, and the first item I pick up is from today's Haaretz editorial for today. The title, Our Debt to Jimmy Carter. Remember, this is Israel's mainstream, most influential newspaper, and not at all radical. It supports the annexation wall. It is not a radical publication. What does it write? Third paragraph of its editorial today, or it starts, but Israelis have not liked Jimmy Carter since he wrote the book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. Israel is not ready for such comparisons, even though the situation begs it. But in the United States, these are considered not just controversial, but outrageous statements. Is the conflict complicated? Well, you read the American journalism, the topic. You read Mr. Goldberg in his book, Prisoners, and he says, in order to understand the conflict, you have to understand the Arab mind. That they are consumed by this Nietzschean ressentiment. They're jealous of those Jews, and they can't understand how those Jews, who they believe they are better than, how these Jews can be dominating us. So it's all about this Nietzschean ressentiment. And then you open up to another grande tête. This one even reads French. Paul Berman, he writes a book called Terror and Liberalism. It's a big bestseller. And he says in the book, he's figured it all out. It wasn't easy. Because if you read George Packer's book, he describes Paul Berman as holed up in his room for months. Books piled from the floor to the ceiling, said Mr. Packer. And then to really impress the reader, he said, and some of the books were in the original French. And then one day, Mr. Berman came bursting out of his study and met Mr. Packer at their favorite bistro. Whenever I hear that word bistro now, I feel like Goebbels with culture. I reach for my gun. In any case, Mr. Berman tells the story. He's unlocked the whole mystery of those suicide bombers. Where does he find the master text? It's Camus, the Rebel. All you have to do is read Camus, the Rebel. First, there was modernism. Then there was the will to rebel. Then there was the will to die, ergo suicide bombers. You have to know it in the original French to understand. But then you come across a book, not nearly as profound, Benny Morris's book, Righteous Victims. Morris, he has to also address the question of why these Arabs don't like Zionism. And he writes as follows: the fear of territorial dispossession and displacement was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. Now, I have to admit, Mr. Morris has changed his views now. He's way off the map. He's, nuked the Arab world. But when he wrote this particular book, The Righteous Victims, it wasn't complicated. Notice Morris never mentions anti-Semitism. He doesn't mention hatred of Jews. He doesn't mention fear of the Enlightenment and the emancipation of women. No. Why did the Arabs not like Zionism? Because they were afraid of losing their homes and losing their country. Fear of dispossession and displacement. And then Mr. Morris goes on to make a remarkable acknowledgement. He says that fear was perfectly rational, because he says transfer, expulsion, was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism. And this aim automatically produced resistance among the Arabs. That exactly what they feared, dispossession and displacement, is exactly what did happen and what was destined to happen if the Zionist movement triumphed. What's so odd about this conflict is, in any other place in the world, the sorts of profound explanations which are put forth would be seen to be ridiculous, the object of ridicule. So you take North America. For those of you who have studied our history, we have to be honest, the Native American resistance to Euro-American encroachment was very bloody. The Native Americans, let's not be so politically correct, they killed men, women, children. It was not for no reason that if you read the old histories up until the 1950s, the old histories, they were referred to as savages. Not that the Euro-Americans were much better, and in many cases much worse, but it was a very ugly scene on both sides. Yet, what would anyone in this room think if a historian were to come along and say that the chief motor of Native American resistance to Euro-American encroachment, the chief motor was anti-Europeanism or anti-whiteism?
Or Nietzschean restoration.
You know, you would obviously laugh because the obvious explanation, fear of territorial dispossession and displacement, the obvious explanation also happens to be a sufficient one. You don't need exotic, profound explanations if the obvious one, fear of territorial displacement and dispossession, if it's a sufficient one there, as it is in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict historically, as well as today as we meet. The other type, and I have 7 more minutes, I'm watching the clock. The other type of false controversy is the playing of the Holocaust card, the dragging in of the Nazi Holocaust to sow confusion and distract attention from the actual record. Time doesn't obviously allow me to go into that topic in any kind of depth. The main point to make for our purposes here is that the main innovation of this Holocaust conglomerate, this Holocaust industry, was this notion of what came to be called Holocaust uniqueness. This claim that no people in the world had ever suffered in the way that Jews suffered during World War II. And a huge a huge publications record has continued to proliferate, trying to prove this thesis of Holocaust uniqueness. As an intellectual claim, it's completely vacuous. As a moral claim, as ought to be obvious to anyone in this room, it's an abomination. The notion of trying to rank human suffering and prove that, say, a child who's napalmed suffers less than a child thrown into a gas chamber. how do you do it? And do you really want to go there? Intellectually, it's vacuous. Morally, it's an abomination. But politically, it's quite useful. Because if you can prove that Jews have suffered uniquely, you then can make a credible claim that because of that unique history of suffering, they shouldn't be held to the same moral and legal standards as everyone else. So, Israel's the only country in the world which legalized torture. But remember the Holocaust. Israel's the only country in the world which legalized house demolitions as a form of punishment. But remember the Holocaust. Israel's the only country in the world which legalized hostage-taking, or as the Supreme Court Justice Barak called it, the taking of bargaining chips. But remember the Holocaust. Or this past summer, July 2006, 2 summers ago now, Israel dropped 4.6 million cluster bomblets on South Lebanon, the densest bombing using cluster bomblets in the history of the world. Actually, nothing compares to it. The closest was 1991, when the US dropped 20 million cluster bomblets on all of Iraq. But the territory here was 1/20th the size. Another unique claim of Israel's. But we're told, remember the Holocaust. The other use of this Nazi Holocaust has, in a strange concatenation, been to either blame the Nazis for the Nazi Holocaust, blame the Arabs for the Nazi Holocaust, or to claim that the Arabs are the lineal descendants of the Nazis. So you had Mr. Ben-Gurion, 1948, Israel's first prime minister, claiming that the Arabs are the disciples and even teachers of Hitler, who know only one way of solving the Jewish problem, their total destruction. During the Eichmann trial, the Palestinian Mufti, the leader of the Palestinian movement, who was a nasty fellow, but they called him among the biggest Nazi war criminals, the real mastermind of the final solution. And then moving up to the present, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, he was called the Hitler on the Nile. Now more close to home, 1991, it was Saddam Hitler, or as Mr. George Bush Sr. used to call him, Saddam Hitler. Then 2003, 2004, it was Saddam Hitler again. Then now it's Hamas is Hitler, Hezbollah is Hitler, Ahmadinejad is Hitler. Everyone is Hitler, everyone is the Nazis. It's a kind of perplexity. On the one hand, we're told, never compare the Nazi Holocaust with any other crime in history, and if you make the comparison, you're guilty of Holocaust denial. But then it so happens that all of Israel's enemies, or alleged enemies, they're all Hitler, they're all threatening a Nazi Holocaust, and they're all Hitler in the past or Hitler in the future. The most recent form of this Holocaust industry is the claim of a new anti-Semitism, which began to proliferate that claim beginning in the early 2000s. The two things that could be said about the new anti-Semitism very quickly, it's not new, has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. How do we know it's not new? It's very simple. Go to your library, plug in new anti-Semitism on the subject heading or title. The first book that will come up, I'm almost certain, is a book that came out in 1974. The title, The New Anti-Semitism, written by the heads of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, the league that supposedly protects Jewish rights. 1981, a book, The Real Anti-Semitism. The the thesis, the world is filled with a new anti-Semitism. Whenever Israel comes under attack because it refuses to resolve the conflict diplomatically, or because of a public relations debacle, they start up this extravaganza called the new anti-Semitism. And they started again in 2001 because of the bad PR due to their repression of the Second Intifada. Everyone in this room can judge on his or her own whether there's any truth to this claim of a new anti-Semitism, because if you read the literature, they claim the heart, the core of this new anti-Semitism is college campuses. It's happening here, right before your eyes. They say that there are literally pogroms, riots, unfolding on college campuses, and Jews are being physically under attack. Well, I have to tell you, I was a little skeptical about that, because I've taught at many universities, more than I care to remember. I've been around the block many times, though it seems it's my last block. And one thing you could say about college campuses, they are so politically correct, you can't be anti-anything on a college campus. You know, the political correctness can sometimes get very stifling and very suffocating. You can't be obviously anti-black, anti-Puerto Rican, anti-woman, anti-gay, anti-tall, anti-short, anti-skinny, anti-fat. You can't. You can't, be anti-aesthetically challenged. No, you can. That's the completely correct term for ugly. You can. So, the notion that amidst all of this stifling and suffocating political correctness, there is this rampant anti-Semitism, of course seems slightly preposterous. I investigated a record some years ago, couldn't find any evidence of it, but of course some of you are thinking, of course you couldn't find any evidence of it. But then I opened up the Chronicle of Higher Education, the main in-house journal for academics, and the lead article reads, "It's a good time to be a Jewish student at an American college." The head of the Hillel says, "It's a golden age of Jewishness on campuses." The head of AIPAC, the main Israel lobby organization, says, "It's a glorious time not only for Jewish student life on campuses, but for the pro-Israel student movement as well," which is exactly what common sense and simple observation would tell you. You go onto a college campus nowadays, you have Judaic studies, you have Holocaust studies, you have Israel studies, you have anti-Semitism studies. The only thing you don't have is a special degree program in Jewish naval contemplation. So how can there be rampant anti-Semitism? It's just not plausible. It's not credible. Okay, what about Europe? What's the record on Europe? I looked through the record, couldn't find any evidence. That's me. So I opened up the best Zionist historian in the world, Walter Laqueur, a leading authority on all topics bearing on anti-Semitism. He writes a book called The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism, came out 2 years ago from Oxford University Press. What does he conclude? Popular attitudes towards Jews were in fact slightly more favorable in 2002 in Europe than they had been in 1991. Not only is there no evidence of a new anti-Semitism in Europe, it's better now than it's ever been before there. Exactly what a rational person would conclude looking at the record. If you take the claims literally, they say in Europe, we're on the verge of a new Nazi-like anti-Semitism, a new Holocaust. It's Germany all over again. Well, then what happens? According to the most recent polls, 3/4 of Israelis want to be in the European Union, and 1/10 would actually leave Israel for Europe if they were granted EU citizenship, which means 3/4 of Israelis want Israel to be allied with Nazis, and 1 in 10 want to be exterminated. Well, and I'll leave it off here. What's the purpose of this claim of a new anti-Semitism? It's fairly obvious. Number one, to turn the perpetrator into the victim. So instead of focusing on the very real suffering of Palestinians, we're supposed to focus on the alleged suffering of Jews in the world today. And number two, to discredit all criticism of Israel as being motivated by anti-Semitism, changing the subject. Is this speculative? Everybody in this room watched it unfold about a half year ago. Jimmy Carter writes a book, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. His conclusions, totally uncontroversial. What happens? First, Mr. Carter is accused of being a plagiarist by Kenneth Stein at Emory University. Second, Professor Dershowitz accuses him of being in the pay of Arab sheikhs. Then he's accused of being an anti-Semite. Then Barbara Lipstadt accuses him of being a borderline Holocaust denier. Then Neil Scher accuses him of being a Nazi sympathizer. Then he's accused of being a supporter of Arab terrorism. Notice what happened. Go back and read the reviews. Nobody talked about the content of the book. The whole discussion became whether or not Jimmy Carter was an anti-Semite. And the record he lays out in the book, not controversial, sometimes quite well done. Chapter 16, The Wall as a Prison. Conclusions are accurate. All of that, our attention is diverted from. We just focus on whether he's a Holocaust denier, anti-Semite, and so forth. Is it reason for despair? No. Actually, the Carter example should give us lots of hope and reasons for optimism. The hope and the optimism is this. Mr. Carter stood his ground. The book went on to be a #1 on the Times bestseller list, sold about 300,000 copies in hardcover. And then Mr. Carter says, I want to go into the lion's den. I want to go speak at Brandeis, the major secular Jewish university in the United States. Student body of about 2,000 turn up to listen. He speaks to the gym. Mr. Carter, he gets 4 standing ovations from an overwhelmingly Jewish student body. Professor Dershowitz is asked to deliver the reply. When he steps up to the podium, they say about 2/3 of the audience walked out. And I think that should encourage us. No, not what happened to Professor Dershowitz, but the main lessons. Number one, stick by the factual record. Stick by the facts. And number two, show a little bit of courage, a little backbone, a little spine. This is America. And unless you are a targeted minority, which very few of us in this room are, you have wide latitude to speak your mind and to tell the truth. Remember, this isn't Gaza. It's not throwing a stone at a tank and you're 5 years old and you end up dead. This is America. If we stick by the facts, we don't exaggerate, don't misrepresent, look at that mainstream record, and show a little courage, a little backbone, I'm very confident, more confident than ever, I think we can win. Thank you.